The reasoning behind this video has long been in the making, but recent events have added impetus to the need for its production. There are several topics I wish to cover, most of which are related to fairly recent phenomena that have occurred in the past year or so. And to begin with, I would like to start this with a thoughtful commentary made by Multishadow 1979, edited for improved grammar, of course. Quote, "Unfortunately, videos like this have to be done. The only way we will reach the truth is if there is an open debate between conflicting ideas, where the most obvious, logical concepts take precedence. That is how the male mind works. Competition takes place, and only the most accurate assessments reach top. The concept of, quote, can't we all just get along, end quote, is a feminine herd mentality, and it usually quickly leads to a flawed ideology, the main tenets of which are whatever plays to overall emotions of the majority, which then ends up taking precedence over truth." An excellent commentary. High Lord Multishadow. This is something of great importance that I have talked about in the past and needs to be reiterated here. There has been a notion wafting about in the air of the manosphere for some time now that because we share sexual organs, we ought simply to get along, no matter disagreement and differing ideas, that criticism should not be exercised towards other men, and specifically men going their own way. And Multishadow has hit the nail on the head in his commentary. It has never been in the nature of man to simply get along for the sake of getting along. That aspect of being was, and always has been, the province of the female, which we sometimes term the Borg consensus. You know quite well what I'm talking about, the herd of human females who might well despise each other and disagree vehemently, but instead of giving air to their differences and disagreements, sit around with teacups, smile at each other, and make niceties. Even if it were something desirable, and I will argue shortly that it is not, it is wholly unachievable and precluded by the very nature of the male. Men study nature, reality, and its workings, and seek the most honest interpretation of those workings possible, and when disagreement arises, there is, in the best of cases, intellectual conflict, and in the worst of cases, regarding the baser matters such as mating rituals, there's violent conflict. But agreement, for the sake of agreement, is neither plausible nor desirable. Agreement for the sake of agreement prevents honest and open discussion of ideas where each person hides behind a facade of nodding and acquiescence, and more importantly, such an approach prevents men from arriving at the understanding they so desperately need. And yet, so many seem to be lost in a choir of singing Kumbaya, and think that getting along at all costs should compromise intellectual honesty, and genuine disagreement that, for better or worse, must be brought to bear and thoroughly dealt with, whatever the unpleasantness of the matter might be. Whatever the ostensible benefits of a false harmony one might imagine, they are not worth the price of the silence of inquiry that would ensue as a result. Let women and feminists nod their heads in rapt agreement, no matter how ridiculous the proposition, and lie to each other. We as men shall examine the things on their own merits and form our own individual conclusions. And if harmony as a consequence then eludes us, then so be it, because someone will have come closer to the truth as a result, and thereby will have been helped without the need for a false pretense of harmony. I also wish to address how criticism is dealt with by those criticized. In order to stifle discussion and shut down criticism, I have been called an elitist. And what is interesting about the term is that prior to voicing criticism, I had never, ever been referred to as an elitist. This singular word is oftentimes, as it is here, a tactic of deflection, which is to say that rather than deal with the arguments being made, a word is used, more often than not a pejorative one, to shut down discussion and thereby evade criticism, and it is a common tactic. Have you ever argued with a traditional conservative, offering legitimate criticism only to be called a leftist, and thus not worthy of his engagement? What of feminists who bandy about the word misogynist as if it were candy on Halloween every time someone puts forth factual arguments against their drivel? The implication is clear. Neither an alleged leftist in the former case, nor an alleged misogynist in the latter needs to be addressed, and thus all arguments and counterpoints made are effectively nullified without addressing said arguments and counterpoints to begin with. So too is this thought to work in the context of my alleged elitism, as I've never been called an elitist prior to offering criticism of someone's content, which is rather amusing, considering I've made videos in the past honoring the contributions and deeds of the everyday man, and indeed, myself, I have worked in manual labor, and out of the blue, I'm suddenly called an elitist. When someone has no counter-arguments to make and seeks to avoid argumentation altogether, a one-word catchphrase often serves the purpose of that avoidance. Whether that one-word catchphrase is actually descriptive of the person being called it, the criticism and arguments made are effectively circumvented, and people begin to focus on irrelevancies. Gentlemen, do not fall for the trap of simplistic name-calling, as if that constituted a valid argument any more than you would settle for being called a misogynist or leftist when pointing out feminist inconsistencies or the incongruities in traditional conservative philosophy. Continuing Multishadow's commentary. Quote, I said this in Barbarossa's last video, but I believe many of the current problems in MGTOW are due to people placing the concept of male autonomy as its central feature rather than the wealth of knowledge it represents. Placing self-determinism as the central talking point allows anyone to claim virtually anything as MGTOW and ignore the foundation of knowledge it is built upon. It also ends up stifling the expansion of thought, because the default response to everything becomes the recurring platitude of, so what, who cares, just go your own way, which tends to shut down discussion and the exploration of new ideas and concepts. Well-placed thoughts, lord of manifold umbri, and ones that in part echo mine, which I shall now expand upon. There is a growing trend, or has been a growing trend in the past year or so within the MGTOW community to stress certain aspects of MGTOW as primary when they are in fact secondary. And accompanying this conflation and confusion, there has been an influx of men into the MGTOW community whose mentality seems anything but going their own way, some of which has been addressed by 2 recent videos by John the Other, matters I will talk about here and elaborate on. For quite some time, members of the MGTOW community were concerned with the possible infiltration by women, which turned out to varying degrees to be justified. But there is now a different concern, and we are in fact witnessing a split within the MGTOW community. As the Lord of Manifold Umbri said, there has been an increasing emphasis put on autonomy rather than the knowledge from which that autonomy is born, which is to say, or rather ask, the very important question, from what does one seek to be autonomous? Autonomy implies independence. But what are these men who self-identify as High Lords of the Autonomous declaring themselves independent from? Based on my observations, very little. As I've previously mentioned, John the Other has already made 2 excellent videos covering one aspect of the topic, namely the introduction of terminology such as beta and alpha that had never been part of the MGTOW parlance until recently, and he has, as I will, correctly identified this as intrinsic to a worldview and a construction of identity that is dependent upon the approval of women. Most of you are by now familiar with the PUA and mainstream terminology of alpha and beta and their application. Simply put, an alpha is a man who receives frequent sexual access to women and consequently the admiration of men, something I will talk about further, and a beta is someone who does not receive this attention. We also know that MGTOW have never used this terminology, since by its very nature, going your own way entails not giving a fuck about what women want or approve of, and has nothing to do with the sexual access women grant to men, which is to say that MGTOW seek to understand female nature so as to not run afoul of it, as opposed to understanding it so as to maximize the frequency of the copulation act. But as is always the case, there is more, and there is something more subtle that has been occurring in the past year. Status, and in particular financial status, goes hand in hand with the necessary means to bed females and be sexually successful. And interestingly enough, in the absence of discussion of sexual success, there has been an increase in the discussion of financial success, specifically as it applies to MGTOW. I am not speaking here merely of men talking about having disposable income or what have you, but rather an obsession with wealth acquisition and monetary status that seems foreign to MGTOW, because escaping a gynocentric worldview entails something more than foregoing terminology such as alpha and beta. It requires understanding and knowledge. Recall previously that I spoke of autonomy in the context of being autonomous from something, and if gynocentrism is the thing from which one seeks autonomy, then understanding the thing from which you seek this independence is not only beneficial, it is an absolute requirement, and the lack of desire to do so is a problem. A declaration of independence from something without first having comprehended that thing in the first place And most importantly, the relationship of that thing to you, the individual man, will almost certainly lead you to not going your own way, but to going evolution's way. In short, autonomy without understanding is little different from conventional autopilot mode. But what do I mean by this? I think the point is best illustrated by an encounter I had a while back in the comments section with a gentleman professing to go his own way and simultaneously bragging about his great financial success and looks. And I asked him why he felt the need to tell everyone, to which he replied that he did not, that he was merely showing how successful MGTOW men can be, and that he pursues wealth and success for himself. That he needed to brag about his alleged success in the comments section was fishy to begin with, but I then proceeded to explain to him that claiming to pursue success for himself struck me as little different to the female claiming to doll herself up for herself or claiming to wear makeup for herself to feel good about herself. He then called me a loser who could not get laid, who was envious of his success, and scurried off. But I tell this tale to illustrate a point. Both the male and female in these examples are working on autopilot and deceiving themselves in the root causes of their motivations. The female might well believe that her application of makeup and short skirt are for feeling good about herself, but anyone with a brain and some basic human knowledge knows this to be a rather bad post hoc rationalization of the reality behind her motivations, which is, of course, to attract men. The feel-good ego effect is merely a residual benefit. Likewise, the churl in the comments section might well believe that he's engaging in wealth acquisition and buying expensive cars for himself, but he's deceiving himself as well. He's doing this to attract women, or, in a more charitable interpretation, he's doing this to further his self-esteem, which is contingent upon the things that women value in men. And what we have seen of late in the manosphere, and specifically the MGTOW community, is an influx of men who, for whatever reason, skipped the understanding part of MGTOW and leapt forward to the autonomy part, having missed the forest for the trees. Instead of dick measuring contests waged along the lines of how many women did you fuck, we see the derivative dick measuring contest of how successful one is and how much money one has. Neither the former nor the latter have any bearing on MGTOW. Now, it is possible that a man could go his own way while still being obsessed with making money as a primary absolute, in the same sense that some men who go their own way cannot or do not want to forego having sex, but are aware of the reasons behind their actions. But these men we have seen of late, who still speak of conventional success models as if they actually bore relevance to MGTOW, are not even aware of why they are doing the things they're doing. And this is well illustrated by some of the blowback, which I embrace and appreciate, subsequent to my response video. What did we see? We saw a slew of men who did not watch the video, or if they did not understand it, claiming the sole reason for me making a video response, and for that matter, my antagonism towards their messianic content producer was envy, though they falsely use the term jealousy, and simply could not fathom why anyone would ever deem to criticize someone, and if he did so, it surely has to be contingent on envy of material wealth and success. You see, to men of this befogged mind, who are still slaves to their instincts and baser motivations, criticism can only be exercised on the ground of success envy, and never because ideas themselves are found to be problematic. And this is because, much like the dog chasing its own tail, these men's vision of the world is one bound by and limited to what women approve of, and by extension the derivative approval received by their fellow men for achieving material success. The realm of ideas is a foreign reality to them. It never occurs to them that ideas might matter, that some ideas are good, some are bad, and some are outright terrible. No, it always comes down to who has the bigger metaphorical dick, or in this case, subscriber count, money, etc., take your pick. These are blue pill men who have completely skipped the understanding component of MGTOW, whilst loudly proclaiming their autonomy from a gynocentrism they are still subject to. And of course, those of you who know me and my work, and have been with me for years, knowing my cerebral nature, do I strike you as the kind of man who is motivated to criticize because I am envious of the material success of others? I think you all know the answer to that. And it should not be lost to you that the claim of envy is yet another tactic meant to stifle actual discussion of ideas, akin to misogynist, leftist, elitist, or any other buzzword. But the question remains, what am I criticizing? The answer is both simple and complex. The simple side of the answer is that I am criticizing a conventional marketing approach to spreading MGTOW, and I characterize that approach as both dangerous and antithetical to what MGTOW is. The complex answer obviously requires more explanation. So let us begin with three quotations taken from Edward Bernays, often called the father of public relations, taken also directly from his appropriately titled book called Propaganda. Quote, "Whatever of social importance is done today, whether in politics, finance, manufacture, agriculture, charity, education, or other fields, must be done with the help of propaganda." Another one, "Continuous interpretation is achieved by trying to control every approach to the public mind in such a manner that the public receives the desired impression, often without being conscious of it." And finally, "Men are rarely aware of the real reasons which motivate their actions." Now, there are two important implications here. One, that important ideas must be disseminated by means of propaganda, and two, that the exercise of said propaganda necessarily involves the manipulation of the unconscious, i.e., that those receiving the propaganda are not aware of that reception. MGTOW is, at its core, about breaking free from the spell of automated behavior and becoming consciously aware of the reasons behind our actions. Effective marketing has, as a requirement, the sublimation, obfuscation of the real reasons that motivate actions. Conversely, MGTOW, as a set of principles or philosophy, has as a requirement the acquisition of knowledge so as to understand the real reasons behind our actions. And thus, there exists a fundamental incompatibility between marketing and the principles of going your own way. MGTOW understand the difference between distal and proximate cause, and are aware that much, if not all, of our behavior harks back to evolutionary impulses that can be hard to break free from. And thus, in a very real sense, MGTOW is about making subconscious impulse conscious knowledge and retroactively correcting those impulses. The problem with propaganda and its modern derivative or alternate name, marketing, is that it relies on impressing upon the unconscious desires and impulses people have and inflates them to even greater degrees than they had been prior to exposure to that marketing. If MGTOW could be summarized in one word, it would be awareness. And if marketing could be likewise summarized, it would be unawareness. And in this sense, marketing in MGTOW is an oxymoron, since the former focuses on obfuscation, whilst the latter focuses on illumination, the former's antonym. And here we return to the problem of autonomy without the requisite knowledge for that autonomy. If marketing is predicated on at least partial misinformation, and men are being exposed to MGTOW via traditional marketing methods, then it comes as no surprise that we have seen an explosion in men self-identifying as MGTOW without the foundational knowledge, who are still wrapped up in conventional means of measuring themselves and others, i.e. the terminology of alpha and beta, and the use of material wealth as a measuring stick of conventional success applied to MGTOW, when in reality, going your way has absolutely nothing to do with these things. But how does marketing work, and what makes it effective? Why do Coca-Cola marketers attach slogans such as "things go better with a Coke" or "you can't beat the feeling" when such claims have no empirical evidence to back them up whatsoever? Marketing, of course, does not work on the basis of empirical evidence. It works on the basis of cues, repetition, and the human neurology that informs our biases. Marketing and brand strategy consultant Douglas Van Pratt has the following to say. Quote, "Take, for instance, the dual purchase of toothpaste and mouthwash. Why would anyone brush with toothpaste clinically proven to whiten teeth and then rinse with a brightly green-colored mouthwash containing blue dye number 1 and yellow dye number 5? And try as you might, you would be hard-pressed to find a brand of mouthwash that doesn't contain artificial dyes and shades that would be most unflattering to the teeth. But through past repetition of other colored products, our unconscious minds have learned to associate the color green with the feelings of clean, fresh, and minty. So much so that now every time we see the color green, it comes with a powerful emotional effect, overriding any concerns about why we're buying the whitening toothpaste in the first place." End quote. This illustrates that much of marketing has to do with repetition and the associations people develop within the context of that repetition. But it should be pointed out that this has nothing to do with the content of the product being advertised, i.e., things go better with a Coke. Well, what things go better with a Coke? That's the question. It is an empty statement that implies meaning without actual meaning being there. We can imagine a similar scenario within the context of the manosphere, where there is a line repeated at the end of each video, "Thank you for taking your daily dose of red pills." And over time, by constantly being repeated, the line drums itself into the minds of the viewers with the imagery of red pill, which is often associated with waking up and awareness, and leads to the effective association of the slogan with that waking up, even if the actual content has little or nothing to do with waking up or awareness. In a not dissimilar fashion to the aforementioned brightly green-colored mouthwash, it is an emotional effect of red and pill coupled with repetition and cues that impress us upon the customer, not the contents of the product, and herein lies the deception inherent in marketing. Van Pratt further states, quote, "Part of the reason this happens is because the brain's emotional systems can function independently from the cortex, the seat of consciousness. Therefore, memories and response repertoires can be formed without us ever knowing. It's like no one was home when we were out and living and learning." Neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux gives an example of how this might happen. Let's say we're having lunch one day, and there's a red and white checkered tablecloth, and we have this argument. And the next day, I see someone coming down the street, and I say, I have this gut feeling about the guy. He's an SOB, and I don't like him. And maybe what's going on there is that he's got a red and white checkered necktie on. Consciously, I'm saying it's my gut feeling because I don't like the way he looks. But what happened is that the necktie has triggered the activation of the amygdala through the thalamus, the so-called low road, triggering a fear response in me, which I now consciously interpret as this gut feeling about me not liking the guy. But in fact, it's being triggered by external stimuli, and I'm not processing it consciously. Likewise, consumers can be both negatively and positively predisposed to a brand based on their unconscious associations with its ads, slogans, logos, mascots, design elements, and brand properties. People may not really know why they love one brand or not another, because conscious thought may have had little to do with the emotional tags that were formed with their preference where learned. For example, a leading beverage company creates a sound when opening the can that was subtly different from other cans to trigger a unique craving for their brand's drink. The manufacturer redesigned the can to create a differentiating, snapping sound, a branded cue of delicious anticipation. They then recorded the sound in the studio and incorporated it into advertising. The manufacturer would play the sound at major concerts and sporting events, seeing an instant uptick in sales for their brand when they did so. Yet when consumers were asked why they suddenly choose that particular beverage over others, they would say things like, "I haven't the faintest idea, I just fell for it." End quote. So the fundamental problem with a marketing approach to spreading a message, or better put, espousing a philosophy, is that those being exposed to the marketing and advertising are not being cued into the actual content of the philosophy, but rather triggers in the form of images, buzzwords, and even sounds. Even if the marketed format applied to MGTOW actually were accurate in its representation of MGTOW philosophy, the foci of the viewer would not be drawn to the philosophy, but rather to the tangential and often unrelated cues used to propagate that philosophy, and thus we see the phenomenon of missing the forest for the trees. In fact, I suspect most of the men who swallow daily doses and profess to enjoy such doses cannot even cite a good reason for it, akin to the phenomenon of having just fallen for it and not knowing why. Likewise, people enjoy routine, such as the daily soap opera, daily radio show, daily news, etc. The quotidian, however, is not a hallmark of quality so much as a reinforcement of our natural inclination towards repetition and routine, so as to create a pattern-filled life. In short, the daily gives not meaning to people's lives, but structure, and one can be sympathetic to this need. But at the same time, the price is paid in loss of meaning. A banal and repetitive soap opera does little to enrich the mental lives of its viewers. But it keeps its viewers glued to watching because it caters to the need for a repetitious structure on a daily basis. Similarly, a repetitious but intentionally structured format in video making will satisfy the primal urge for structure, but leave gaping epistemological holes in the minds of its viewers. The truth is, men, is that there is no daily fix to the problem of male identity and contentment, no dispensary of pills which you can take to supply you with answers, and more often than not, coming to terms with reality is accompanied by a lack of structure, entropy, if you will. And whilst it is a male universal to be faced by the problem of identity and meaning, it is the province of the individual man to make sense of it all and find meaning in a chaotic world. Rest assured, deception will not lead you to that meaning, but will continually lead you back to where you started. Without the epistemic basis for MGTOW, one cannot achieve the level of satisfaction that is available to men who choose to go their own way after having acquired the knowledge that allows one to do so. And what one gets instead is a perpetual feedback loop of discontent. After all, without understanding why they are angry, frustrated, or hurt, men are not in a position to move past those emotional states to a place where such emotions are no longer relevant. And then there's the phenomenon of the repeat customer, as when it comes to content of the sort I've mentioned, there is an element of dissatisfaction involved. After all, why continually return to the same thing over and over and over again, if not for being at least partially dissatisfied, but also not knowing how to become fully satisfied on your own? Repetitious daily content provides a placebo effect and temporary fix for this, and this perpetual dissatisfaction loop is inherent to the nature of propaganda and marketing, as such practice can only flourish given a basic level of dissatisfaction, and most importantly, it is vital that the consumer of the product never be fully satisfied, lest he no longer consume the product in question. There is value in knowledge, and there is power in knowledge. And that power lies in the ability for men to transform their lives by understanding their own nature, the relationship of that nature to others and the world at large, thereby achieving a peace of mind unavailable to the blue pill masses, but a foregoing of the epistemic process that leads to the long-term reward by chasing the short-term rewards most are familiar with, keeps men lockstep in a prison of unhappiness of their own making without any key in sight. Knowledge is that key, and it is the key to freedom. Not as some might imagine, a financial freedom, which is merely an ancillary derivative, but a freedom from the prison and suffering of one's own mind, the needless urges, instincts, and ignorance that have plagued you since the days of yore. MGTOW is a path to that freedom, but it cannot be followed in the form of deception, manipulation, or by using the very tools that are employed by society and mass media to ensnare and ensorcel men in an effort to maintain that ignorance of who and what they are, and keep them forever bound to a cycle of suffering many of us known and have subsequently broken free from. Thanks for watching.